We love Las Vegas food and for years have been covering the exciting developments in the city's diverse dining scene. The culinary offerings in Las Vegas span cuisines, styles, and budgets, with restaurants from some of the most recognizable culinary figures in popular culture, including Wolfgang Puck, Bobby Flay, Giada De Laurentiis, and Guy Fieri. We recently took a break from our usual programming to highlight an exciting and diverse lineup of Las Vegas chefs and restaurants. We've chatted with the biggest names as well as some rising stars who will be appearing on the marquee for years to come. Check out these really cool episodes in the This Is Taste podcast feed.
She wanted me to write about the Jews, and she said, I want you to write about how Jews have changed food in America and how America has changed Jewish food. I thought, what a great idea. And I think this book changed America's feeling about Jewish food.
This is Taste. I'm your host, Matt Rodbard. How cool was it to have Joan Nathan into our studio? Joan is a longtime chronicler of Jewish food culture around the world and author of many cookbooks on the topic, including her latest and final book, My Life in Recipes, Food, Family, and Memories, which she put out this spring. In this episode, we talk about Joan's long journalism career, including working at the Washington Post and the New York Times, and writing across the world of food. We also get into some of her favorite lasting recipes from Jewish traditions around the world. You're going to want to stick around for this great conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Joan Nathan, welcome to This Is Taste. How are you?
Fine. How are you?
I'm really happy you're here, and we can talk about your book, My Life in Recipes, and I'm going to take a little bit of a chronological approach. I typically don't do that with guests, but this is a book about your life, and really does go in order a bit. And I want to talk about, obviously, the Jewish diaspora, about the Middle East, about your history reporting for the Washington Post, the New York Times, and also your time working in Israel and Jerusalem. There's a lot in between. You're a Wolverine as well. You surprised me. I took about 3 hours with your book last night, and I just couldn't stop reading it.
Wow, good.
I love it.
I like that. I love it.
No, I'm a fan of your work broadly, but then when you read this book, you really get a sense of who you are and not just the recipes. And I really want to start with your grandparents and your parents' generation. This is like the first generation Jews coming from Europe. Let me ask you broadly, how was their relationship with food changed as they immigrated to America?
It's interesting. My mother, who was a typical, I guess she's considered first-generation American. She was born here. She wanted American food, and her mother and father wanted American food. And that was very typical of some of the immigrants. There's a wonderful, I forget her name, but there's a wonderful writer who talks about the immigrant of my mother's, the Eastern European immigration, and that some people wanted pastrami, and they thought of salad as cabbage. My mother wanted lettuce, and lettuce was for them was lettuce, And there's a wonderful book where the sweatshop operator takes out one of the women, and he says, "Where do you want to go to eat?" And she said, "I want to go to a restaurant with lettuce and salad." And he said, "Oh, that's not food." So he wanted to take her to a regular, like Katz's.
Yeah. So when your grandparents moved to America, how different was the food for them?
Oh, it was totally different. I mean, it was Eastern European food. There wasn't a lot of it, first of all. And don't forget, in those days, people didn't have fresh food from all over.
Yeah.
And this is Eastern European. My father's family, on the other hand.
The Germans, right?
The Germans.
Yeah.
They came over because of Hitler. They didn't come over to have a better life. They had a good life in Germany. And they came over and they really wanted to replicate a lot of the recipes, like brains with capers and Schaller and Weber,
Yep.
Frankfurters and
Yep. That kind of like that Bavarian cuisine, like the real German cuisine.
And it was good. I would go over to my aunt's on Saturdays and eat with them. And I think that was partially how I got interested in food.
Yeah. Well, your career, it's not just cookbook writing and food writing. You had an interesting career. And I love this line. When I was 26, there were two things I knew. I wanted to fall in love, but more than that, I wanted to live an interesting life.
Right.
And I love that line because you clearly did. And it wasn't with food. When you wrote that or thought that, what were you doing in your life at 26?
Well, I was single in New York City.
Yeah.
I was working at the Institute of International Education doing PR for them. But more than anything else, I was trying out recipes that Craig Claiborne put in the New York Times. But somebody who had been in the Peace Corps told me the most interesting place he had ever been to was Israel. And so I thought, I'll go to Israel. But even though my father pushed it down, he was a Zionist, he pushed it down my throat. I never wanted to go there. But then when somebody my age said that, I thought, oh, good, I'll do that. So I went, and it just blew my mind. It was sort of like the Wild West in those days.
I mean, it's the summer of 1969, and that's a time with the moon landing and great cultural change in America. And you're going to this country that's very young, and it is the Wild West. Literally, it is like the desert. Joan, what's it like in Israel in 1969 for you?
Well, it was just what you were saying. I just remember going to the desert more than anything else and feeling very free,
Yeah.
And I actually, in the moon landing, I arrived the day before, and the president of NYU was visiting the president of the Technion, who was a very good friend of my father's in Haifa. And so they invited me to come. And here I was watching the moon landing on television, probably a small box with this president of NYU. It was just sort of astounding for me. And then the president offered me a job to come to Haifa to work for him. And I didn't want to leave. I was in Jerusalem, and I really didn't want to leave Jerusalem. I mean, Jerusalem also the stone was so extraordinary. And the light was it was so different. It was great.
Yeah, you mentioned it. Jerusalem seems to be your favorite place to visit in Israel, and when you're living there in 69 and later on, we'll get to that. What's the food like in Israel in 1969?
Well, there was this unusual dish called hummus. I had never had it in my life. And people, that was what you would get in the old city. And Israelis, it was a cheap protein. It was, the oldest protein known to mankind. And that's what everybody was eating. They also ate falafel, again, from chickpeas, which was a cheap protein. It was different. I mean, no hot dogs, it was just, I loved it.
So with hummus, it's definitely like this staple of the cuisine. So you've got your hummus in 1969, but are there restaurants outside of the hummus shayas? Like, what's it like?
No, I'll tell you what there were. There were restaurants, quasi or ersatz Italian. There was a place called Fink's, which is all the journalists went there. Tiny little restaurant that had German food, good schnitzel.
Yeah.
There was a Cohen's, which was, I think he was Moroccan. He had every kind of stuffed vegetable. That was another tiny little restaurant. There weren't that many restaurants, and they were expensive for tourists, and they weren't very good.
They weren't very good. It was, the cuisine was just starting to figure out itself as a
the country was starting to figure out itself.
Right, the country's cuisine, right? Now, you end up working for the mayor of Jerusalem as an attaché, and really the narrative in this book is amazing. You get to rub shoulders with dignitaries and celebrities and lots of amazing food writers and people in the food world. It feels very cinematic. Hope you can get that movie made one day. let me ask you about being an attaché. You're like kind of like the liaison. You're showing celebrities and dignitaries around Jerusalem. What are some of the meals you're having at that time?
Well, that's really what made me learn about Jerusalem. Because let's say you went to the Sisters of Zion convent with the mayor of Jerusalem. Well, they would make for you delicious pies, French pies, and really good food. Or the Russians would serve Russian food, and religious Jews would serve heavyish food. And Teddy Kollek would eat with such vigor.
Mm.
And I noticed that if you ate people's food, then you liked them. And I remember one instance in particular. It was after there had been a terrorist attack. I don't even remember if you remember this. It was a Japanese terrorist attack on a plane. And there were a lot of people that were hurt. And Teddy and I went to visit them in the hospital. And then he said, well, you want to go out to eat? And I had just heard about a tiny little Moroccan restaurant. And it cost maybe 5 shekels. It was very cheap. And it was delicious, stuffed vegetables and just delicious, delicious food. And Teddy said to me after we were there, you know, all these Americans go to the King David Hotel and get really expensive, horrible food. And look at this hole in the wall, delicious for so cheap. And that's what I found all over Jerusalem.
And so you start showing people around to these restaurants and kind of, I would say, probably inadvertently helping bring this cuisine into more of a lexicon, right? Like this is such a
well, that's a good word to use because it did. You know, what is the lexicon of Jewish food, really?
right.
I mean, of Israeli food. That's different from Jewish
Of
food.
course, right. And that's a good distinction to make.
And it was beginning. You know, it was like, what did people like to eat? So they were, let's say you were a Libyan Jew. There was this thing called mafroum, which was pieces of potato with sandwiched between ground beef. Yeah. And it was delicious. And that has become part of the legacy of Jewish Israeli food. And, you know, other things, the wonderful Moroccan salads and the Tunisian salads. And that, too, has become Israeli. But it came from Morocco. It came from Tunisia. You know, the hummus is of the region. It had been around for thousands of years. Even the Epic of Gilgamesh mentions hummus, and so does the Bible, where a shepherd was, a farmer was preparing food for the farmhands. And he made pita bread. And then it said that it was dipped in vinegar. But vinegar it's not the word that it really was. It was hummus.
Wow.
Because if you think about it, if you have people working for you and you just let them have it dipped in vinegar, that people are working hard, they're not getting any protein.
Right.
So it was an ancient word for hummus, and that's what they were dipping it in.
It was like a substantial meal and not the condiment. You think?
Right.
Yeah.
And it might not have had the sesame because sesame came from China. Mm-hmm. We don't know when it really hit the Middle East.
Right. It came from China. Did it come from Ethiopia too, the sesame, or was it mostly?
Well, you know, that's a good question because I did go to Ethiopia to the tahina harvest. It probably was there too.
Yeah, it probably came from both sides as well. It's an interesting path of hummus. We could do a whole episode on hummus if we wanted, but we end up back in America after 1973. And you're thinking about a cookbook. You're pitching this idea that you collaborated with somebody with, and you went to 16 publishers, and they all said no. One eventually said yes. And let me ask you, why was it such a tough sell?
Well, I wrote it with another person, Judy Stacy Goldman, and who worked in the mayor's office as well. And by the way, I recommend this if you're doing your first cookbook because you'll end up not doing it unless you have somebody pushing you.
Yeah, that's good advice.
Lots of the publishers said that if you want to write something on Jerusalem, it has to be kosher. And we were young, we felt, wait a minute, you know, there are Jews, Christians, and Muslims in Jerusalem, and that's what I wanted to portray. So I didn't want it to be totally kosher.
Yeah, I mean, from the jump, you wanted to show this complex population,
Right.
mosaic of people in Jerusalem, which
Right.
is such a great journalistic instinct, and not trying to do this book that was only for one population.
Exactly. And, we felt strongly about it. So there was one journalist who had been in Jerusalem who knew us, and he worked for Time magazine that owned Little Brown
Yep.
at the time, and they accepted it. But what they did do, which was really kind of stupid, but they did it, when they were doing marketing, there was one recipe from an Israeli art school, and it was a shrimp teriyaki.
I know where this is going.
In their marketing tools, they had this shrimp teriyaki on sending it to all the Hadassah ladies in America.
Yeah, the Hadassah ladies aren't going to be loving that shrimp cocktail, or shrimp on the Barbie. Yeah, that's an unforced error from your publisher, but
Right.
But certainly you were able to redeem yourself, and this is book 12 that you're on.
Exactly.
And we'll talk a little bit more about your career. Let's move outside of cookbooks though, and you end up in Boston. You wrote a column there, and then you ended up in the Washington Post. In 1987, or until 1987, and what are you covering at both Boston and Washington Post? What type of you're not just writing about Jewish or Israeli food; you're writing about other things too.
Well, at that time, I thought maybe I wanted to get a PhD in anthropology. I didn't know what, and when I
PhD, why? Oh,
that's
man.
exactly I didn't do it.
Yeah.
I thought, what would I do differently?
No.
I wouldn't do anything differently. So when I went to the Boston Globe, I showed the then editor of the magazine, somebody named Tony Spinazzola, who was a beloved individual in Boston at that time, that I was writing this book, The Flavor of Jerusalem. And I said, I just want to write about ethnicity in Boston because it was such an interesting, and it's an interesting city. At that time, there were lots of ethnic pockets. So he said, well, why don't you write about ethnicity and food? So I did, and I found all these wonderful people. But, it was baptism by fire. I'd never really written for a newspaper.
Yeah, and then it has its own process and standards, and you end up in the Washington Post, and you write candidly how you were offered a weekly column and you turned it down, and you openly acknowledge, did I make a mistake? Because that's a pretty big deal to be given a weekly column, but you had a reason why you turned it down.
Well, I mean, at that time, I was at how old was I? 32 years old.
Yeah.
And my mother, of course, had all she wanted was for me to get married.
Yeah.
And here I was, when I went in there, I was pregnant with this baby, and who's a journalist now. But I'd been working since I went to college. So that was like almost 10 years of working. And I just got panicky when they asked. And so I thought, is it okay if I just do it when I want to? And they said, yeah. I mean, they were really nice.
Yeah. I mean, they just saw talent and they clearly wanted more. And you made the wise decision to have work-life balance before that was even a term.
It's funny that you say that because I was just looking at something that Marion Burroughs wrote about me when I hadn't ever seen, or I'd never noticed it before. When I wrote my American Folklife Cookbook, she wrote this, she said something about that I was fast becoming an expert on ethnicity in America. And I thought, oh, or something like that. And I was like, she noticed that? It was like, I just did things because I wanted to do. I mean, it was really kind of.
You're a naturally inquisitive person. You've got the reporting chops, and it kind of all lined up at some point.
I think so.
Yeah, I'd love to get Marion on the podcast.
Oh, yeah, you should call her.
I know I need to call her and you talk about that plum tart recipe.
Oh, yeah.
The most famous recipe in the New York Times.
Right,
to
absolutely.
This day. I'll give a segue here. You end up at the New York Times, which I believe is probably when you really, became Joan Nathan. As we know today, writing regularly about cuisine, about ethnicity, and then writing about Jewish food. To this day, I feel like you've written. I saw your byline in the Times recently,
right?
And that's prolific, more than most. And let me ask you: when you joined the New York Times, there's a deep bench of reporters there. Ruth Reuschel is there as well, who I know you're friends with and interviewed you recently here in New York. What's it like being on the staff, and so to speak, of the New York Times food desk?
Well, I was always freelancing.
Freelance. Yeah, I said so to speak because you're so regular. You weren't technically staff, but you were there writing a lot.
Well, I mean, things have changed a lot at the Times. It used to be a lot, in a way, more difficult. There's much nicer now. Everybody's nicer.
It seems that way.
Yeah.
They're very nice there now.
Yeah.
The food desk, they're very nice people.
Really and truly, it's been a pleasure. I've just found that people, I don't know if they've respected me, but they've always been really respectful. And I remember when I first started, when, Sam Sifton started as the editor. And he's also somebody who's, I think he knows who he is. Mm-hmm. And he came up to me and he said, "Thank you so much for writing for the New York Times." And I thought, wow.
Yeah.
That's really something. And he's always been sort of embarrassingly, when I come in, sometimes he'll say, "Joan Nathan's here,"
I love it. Well, you are a fixture, and Sam knows that to pay respects to somebody who's written so many. I looked back at your archive. I mean, it's a lot of articles. I mean, gosh, it's a lot. And you just popping out of your head, favorite story in the New York Times, favorite story you worked on. I'm gonna pop in this random question. Do you have like a moment that you just were so happy to report that?
Oh, I'll tell you. It was not a Jewish article. It was somebody's 100th Thanksgiving. Her name was Maddie Ball Fletcher. She was a woman. I loved her. She was from Little Washington, Virginia.
Yep. And
she remembered when there were ice blocks bringing oysters up the Rappahannock River. And when she planted salsify, and she had this great accent, loved to cook, loved to garden, and she made candied grapefruit peels for the Inn at Little Washington.
Oh, which is an absolute legendary restaurant, absolute legendary place.
And she was very Southern. I mean, she was the real deal. I loved her.
I mean, 100 years old at that time, she probably knew people who fought in the Civil War.
Right.
I mean, that's the age that you're talking about.
And this was must have been about 1987.
Yeah.
And I remember when I was writing the article on her, the then editor, Margot Slade, was on the phone with me because you were on the phone those days, right? And my husband and I were going to a dinner. It was just when the Soviet Union was collapsing. And Gorbachev was walking, it's at a pay phone, right?
Yeah.
Gorbachev was walking by me, and I said to her, "Can I call you back?" She said, "No, we've got questions, and this is going to be one of the most important food articles in the New York Times." And I thought, but I want to look at Gorbachev,
Wow, what an amazing context for that piece. And so your editors are ringing you up for fact check and last minute edits because there's no email, there's no Word doc with copy changes in it. Yeah, it's a different time. Let's take a food break. We'll get back to your narrative, but I don't want to get too far without talking about food. I'm just asking you straight up, Joan Nathan, how do you do brisket? Your brisket.
Slow, long, with tomatoes, red wine, a lot of red wine, thyme, all kinds of herbs, and lots of onions and carrots. Very simple. Salt and pepper.
Do you feel that briskets served at Passover and throughout the year are too lean?
Oh, well, you need the fat to make it delicious. And then what I do is I make it, refrigerate it, cut off the fat, and then slice it, and sometimes freeze it.
Yep.
Or just slice it in the sauce. And I reduce the sauce.
Yeah, you always reduce the sauce.
I always reduce the sauce. And then what I do is just serve it in a casserole. It's done. It's just done.
The 90s were tough when it came to home cooking because it was like this era of fat-free cooking. And I feel like a lot of these recipes need fat for flavor.
No question.
How did you negotiate that era, being someone who was writing Jewish cooking and having this subtext of it needs to be fat-free, but you obviously know it can't be?
Well, I think I tried those really lean cuts, and it just didn't work for me.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, I'm cutting off the fat, but I'm getting the flavor of the fat. And you just don't tell people.
It's my policy too with cooking. You should never let people know how much butter you cook with at home.
Absolutely.
You just never want to it's like a restaurant, of course.
And that's right. Absolutely.
Moussakhan.
Oh my God, it's the most delicious chicken dish in the world.
It seems like it. Let's go through this dish. It really stuck out at me. It's a dish that I want to cook.
Well, I mean, and I learned it from believe it or not, I wanted to learn to make it. I was writing this cookbook. I was at Harvard in a I forget what it was called, mid-career program at the Kennedy School. And somebody that was in my class with Daniel Patrick Moynihan was the Minister of Information from Jordan. And he didn't know anybody in Boston. So knowing me, I went up to him in the first class and I said, I lived in Israel and I want to learn to make moussakhan. And he said, absolutely, invite me to your house. And he didn't have his family there.
Yeah.
And his name was Adnan Abu Odeh. And he was a wonderful, wonderful man. He became a really good friend of my husband's and mine. Of course, my husband being kind of political, he just loved anyone political.
Yeah.
So he came over and showed me how to make it. And honestly, I still think I make the best moussakhan.
Let's go through the recipe that you have in the book.
Okay. So you just take, just regular cut up chicken. And you put a lot of onions, and I usually use red onions now, and a lot of sumac.
Yeah.
And
Lebanese sumac is the best.
It's really delicious. Yeah. And then and sauteed onions, sumac, a lot of pine nuts, and you could put a tiny bit of cloves if you want to. I don't usually, or cinnamon. I'm pretty much straight, but that's the way he was. And then you cook it for maybe an hour in the oven. And then what you do is you take a big piece of lavash if you want to, or 2 pieces of lavash, put them on a big a tray, and then you put the chicken on top and put the onions on top and the pine nuts on top.
Goes over it, right?
And then bake it in the oven just to really clinch it. and then you serve it on a big tray and eat it by hand so that you can soak up a lot of olive oil.
I think I'm doing this for Passover. I'm like debating about a chicken dish.
Put it on matzah.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right.
It would be delicious.
I'm thinking like that was my thought, like maybe with a matzah, some lavash, but with sumac, which I have some. I got in Israel last year, so
oh yeah,
I'm gonna do that. I wish we could go over more recipes, but I want to continue on your journey in writing. Tell me about working with Judith Jones. At Knopf, this is a big topic now. There's a great book coming out about Judith Jones that Sarah Franklin wrote, and I want to get your experience working with Judith Jones.
Well, I spoke to Judith just after I wrote my first cookbook.
Wow. I
went to visit her, and I was very young, and she wanted me to write an American cookbook, and I didn't want to do it. I wanted to write. I thought, I know about Jerusalem. I don't know about being Jewish. So I turned them down. So then later, I had a new agent, and she said, Judith Jones wants to speak to you. She was doing Knopf Cooks America.
Oh, right. Yep.
She wanted me to write about the Jews, and she said, I want you to write about how Jews have changed food in America and how America has changed Jewish food. And I thought, what a great idea. I'd already written, by the way, a Jewish cookbook with Shakin, which is now part of the Random House group, in 1979. So this was about 1990. And I thought, what a great idea. So I plunged in, and it was really interesting. And I think, in a way, this book changed America's feeling about Jewish food. Yeah. It became something more of a cuisine. And then it became a classic.
So this is the Knopf Cooks book?
This is called Jewish Cooking in America.
Cooking.
And it was the most popular, according to Judith, of all the Knopf Cooks books.
Yeah.
And the thing about Judith is that she was tough, but for some reason we really got along. Really got along. I mean, she traveled with me. Sometimes I would go to Vermont a lot. She came to Washington.
Amazing you went up to her house in Vermont. That's cool.
Oh, yeah. That was part of the tradition of writing a book with her. And, we'd plunge into the water, cold water, early in the morning before breakfast. Then we'd have a civilized breakfast. Sometimes I'd want to clean out her refrigerator because she would keep things forever. And then we'd spend the morning working on the manuscript, having lunch, maybe just making a recipe from the book. And in the afternoon, we'd go visit somebody, maybe a cousin of hers or a cheesemaker.
So great. We talk about slow food a lot in the food writing world. This is like slow cookbooks,
right?
The way you're doing this. And it's just such a great way to think about when your editor is inviting you to their summer place to do some like one-on-one editing. And I know this does happen still to this day, but it's very rare.
And I brought my mother with me.
Oh, right.
And my mother, who was a little bit older than Judith, they really got along tremendously.
Yeah.
And that was pretty nice for me. If Judith wrote the word nice in her green pencil, that was a big deal.
Yeah. Tough with the pen.
Tough.
That's an understatement.
Yeah.
But just her instincts are there's no one like her.
She called me. It was just after Thanksgiving. I remember I had this phone call. I had handed in my manuscript, I thought, complete. And she said, you've got to come to New York. I remember her saying, you've got to come to New York. She said, I don't understand what you're doing in this book. And I remember my stomach.
Yeah.
Anyway, so.
You called the principal's office.
Right. As soon as we were off the phone, I knew what I had to do. It just it was so clear to me. I would have a good historic introduction. I had made it historically, starting, with the early Jews, the next, but this is a cookbook. So I thought I'll do the introduction historically, and then when I do recipes, I'll do a big head notes, which I like to do.
You do. I love that about you.
Yeah, really?
Chunky head notes, man.
Chunky.
My style, too. Don't scrimp on the head notes. Fight for those words.
Yeah, and the funny thing about those head notes is somebody wrote a scholarly piece on cookbooks and cited that my cookbooks were the first ones to use it. I know I saw that. I never found it again. Anyway, so by the time I got to New York City, I just told her what I thought was right, and she agreed with me. And, so that she could look at things, I couldn't see them.
Yeah, that's a good editor. So you kind of reorged the book a little bit. You just reordered it. You had, instead of being linear, like old to middle to, you just kind of did the introduction, and then you kind of reordered it by cuisine type or made it more traditional cookbook. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And because you want to sell it as a cookbook. So if you don't do that, it's going to be hard.
I like your instincts, though. That's my instincts as well as an author. I always want to have more history, more story, and less recipes. And I always think that when you write a cookbook, you want context. And I don't want to ever cut that out.
Right. Well, I mean, I didn't cut it out. I didn't cut anything out.
That's good. You just was a reorg. Okay.
And thank goodness that we had computers. Because in my first book, I had typed it, and if there was one mistake on a page, they made you type the whole page over.
That's nightmare. That's like a nightmare for like a modern writer. I mean, do you really think this is a great topic? How much better would your books have been if you would have had technology on your side, like the cloud had Google Docs?
I don't think I would have written more detailed books, but I think that there's so many more books that are coming out now because of technology that people wouldn't have had the patience to type. I knew nothing else besides a typewriter.
Yeah, so I guess it's all relative. So, Joan, let me ask you about the book, My Life in Recipes. What inspired you to write your life story through recipes?
I was talking to my now editor, Lexi Bloom, and we were just talking. I think she was staying at my house, and I showed her a lot of things that I had. I have letters from everybody. I have my great-grandparents' 50th wedding menu.
Oh, wow.
And I have lots of German Jewish cookbooks, handwritten for my family for generations. And just the idea came out, let's do a book but she thought like a hybrid.
Mm-hmm.
So there'd be not just one recipe after each chapter, but like 100 recipes, and then text. So she had the text of my life is in gray, and the recipes are in white.
Yeah.
White background, gray background, and then of course COVID happened, and my husband passed away. So I mean, I was sort of in a state of shock. But I found that getting up early in the morning, I don't know about you, but I love to write in bed. It's my favorite place to write. First thing in the morning. So I would get up and write, and it would make me think about life with my husband and, what our life was like and everybody's life together. And so I was able to write the book.
Dig those memories out.
Dig them out. And then I'd have to go back and find the real reality.
Yeah, the fact checking. And did you people back in Israel? You had to get in touch with some people who were there at that time.
Yeah, and luckily there was the internet. That made it so much easier. So everything I did, I checked with people.
Do you think this is your last cookbook?
That's what I think. My kids don't think that I will, but I think it's my last cookbook.
Are you happy with this decision?
I just want to see what I'm going to do with my life.
Yeah.
But I am.
Yeah.
I think it's a good way to end, and it's a wonderful book.
It really is. It is a wonderful book. I'm glad you say that because it is so true. And you don't want to have that deadline gnawing at your.
No, that's what I don't want.
Yeah, right.
I mean, a small deadline. I don't mind. I love writing for the Times, and there's some other magazines that have asked me to write, and I think I'm going to get involved with a project at the Leo Baeck Institute on old cookbooks that I think maybe I can help with, and it'll make me understand a lot of the cookbooks in my family collection.
Oh, that's cool that you'll have that.
So there, and I want to travel, see my grandchildren, play tennis as long as I can.
Yeah. Are you living in Washington most of the year, or do you?
I live in Washington and Martha's Vineyard in the summer, and I'm in California in the winter. So
where do you go in California?
Well, to LA where my kids are, and my daughter is building a little apartment for me in her house. And,
that's nice.
And I go to Palm Springs.
Oh, really? Okay.
I love Palm Springs.
I was going to say, that's interesting. So do I. I've been there like 15 times.
Really?
Yes, I was just there a month ago.
Oh.
Yeah.
Did you ever go to Cheeky's?
Of course I go to Cheeky's. Did you ever go to Billy Reed's?
No.
Billy Reed's, you don't know about the pie place? Billy Reed's on East Palm Canyon?
No, but I'll have to go.
Oh my gosh, we could go all day on Palm Springs spots.
Really?
Cheeky's is pretty good. I mean, I think of Palm Springs as having just the best weather. What do you do in Palm Springs?
Well, this year, first of all, I do lots of hiking. Lots. Yeah. My daughter finds all kinds of places to hike. Yeah. So we all go hiking. I take an exercise class in the public pool, which is so much fun. I play tennis with the owner of Cheeky's, who's a good friend of mine. Yeah. I don't know. They're, Palm Springs, I mean, not the rest of it. Like, I don't like Palm Desert or any of those other places.
You're not going to Coachella, yeah.
No, but Palm Springs reminds me of the Wild West. Yeah. I feel it's wild there in a way. It's sort of, it's wonderful.
If you're out in the nature and you've got two mountain ranges connecting each other. We could do a whole Palm Springs episode. We could just do that.
Let's go together.
Let's hang out together, Joan. I want to ask you about this quote that stuck with me. I have visited Jewish Israeli home cooks of Moroccan, Libyan, and Iraqi backgrounds. I've sat on the floor of the Druze, Syrian, and Kurdish kitchens, Molen Kibbeh. I have visited Palestinian villages where I've tasted sun-kissed figs plucked straight from the trees and Israeli Arab villages. Sadly, I could not have had those first experiences today. So I want to close and get a little bit into the geopolitics because I think we can't avoid this question. And
right.
I just want to get your sense of what you can't do today and maybe, just maybe, how we can maybe get back to that time.
Oh, my heart is broken. It's going to take a long time. It's going to take a really long time. There's just so much trust has broken down on both sides, and so many horrible things have happened. I don't know.
Yeah, I feel like that's the right response, and I agree with you. There isn't a hard response, right? Let me ask you about the rise of anti-Semitism in America. It seems in the past year it's gotten worse than ever.
I've read about it. I haven't felt it in the least. We've all been sort of surprised at the amazing reception of my book, and I think in part people want something positive. And I have not felt anti-Semitism. And I feel I'm American, and, I have had, knock on wood, a very good life. And I think my book reflects that. And I just think that we all want to feel good or better. We just need that right now. And I think that, again, breaking bread with other people. I mean, look at my friend Jose Andres. He and I both feel the same thing, that when you break bread with people, you can't not be friends. And bread, in Arabic and Hebrew is very closely aligned with the word life.
Yeah.
Bread, l'chaim and lechem, and also kups and some other words. They're very close to life. And that's what everybody wants, is a good life.
I think that's well said. And just having experience in Israel, the country, I mean, how do you square the perception of the culture within Israel, within the borders of the intermingling of cultures, the people of many different backgrounds calling themselves Israelis, and then certainly some perception that there is more conflict within Israel, within the country, than there really is. So I guess, how do you square that perception with reality?
Well, it's interesting you should ask that question, because I've been thinking about a lot of people in Arab villages in Galilee and all over. I think they want to stay where they are. This is their home. And I don't think that most people want anything different for the Arabs or Jews. They just want peace. And the way that Jerusalem is such a mosaic of people, I always think of them as people, like each one, Arab, Jew, Christian, they're going full force in the direction that they want to.
Yep.
Not like this, with their hands
Blinders,
on either side of their face. And they're doing their lives. We're all doing our life as we want it. And they don't want to be bothered by other people. And I think that's the way they really want to live.
That's my experience as well in Israel. I think you've said it so well. People moving straight ahead in their lines of their cultures. I want to give space for others in this conflict, in this war that we're having, in the people of Gaza. And I'd like to get your sense of how we move forward. How are the people of Gaza, who we really feel for? How do those individuals move forward?
Well, the problem, I mean, it's not just Israel's problem, but the problem is, Egypt doesn't want them. Saudi Arabia doesn't want them. Nobody's really wanted them. So that my heart goes out to them. But I also think that I don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
I just don't know. And it's just a very sad, horrible time.
Yeah.
That's all.
I agree with you. That's well said. And I wasn't asking for answers, and you were being very honest that you couldn't provide a clear answer. I just think showing clear empathy for the people of Gaza is important per our conversation and talking about Israel as a state and all that. So I think that needed to be clear. So I want to thank you for sharing those thoughts. So Joan, on This Is Taste, we asked guests about their discerning taste. So to close this interview, here's a little rapid fire, fast and furious taste check. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
The best fruit.
A really good, ripe peach. picked off my tree
You have a peach tree.
on the vineyard.
Oh, yeah.
And the peaches are so good if the crows don't get them.
Oh, yeah, that's the problem with orchards. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
the bugs and the crows. Great answer. The worst vegetable.
I don't know. I was thinking the turnip maybe.
Yeah.
It's not that interesting.
Yeah, doesn't do much for me either. The best dessert.
Well, there's a dessert that I love called Dampfknödel. And it's in Jewish Cooking in America. I did not put it in my Life and Recipes, which is probably stupid of me to say while being interviewed right now. But it's like a brioche-like dough with a caramel that's put on the bottom. And then it's flipped. And then you serve it with either ice cream or whipped cream or a wine sauce. It's a Southern German delicacy that is amazing.
It sounds technically difficult to pull off.
It's difficult, but it's not so difficult. And what I really love about it is I realize I'm tampering with history when I'm making it, and I love that.
And that's the best. That's what a recipe developer has to do. We call it spins or twists, but tampering is more. It's a harder version of that. But I love it. Your favorite American fast food chain?
I was thinking, I don't think I really have a favorite.
Yeah, I get it.
I went to, what's it called? The Chick-fil-A, and there were so many people there.
Yeah.
I tasted it because I thought, I've never, it's all right.
Yeah.
But
Decent. Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. I like that. I like that response. You're being honest. All right. This is a big one. Your favorite cookbook of all time?
I think Julia's Mastering the Art of French Cooking.
Great answer. There's no other answer. Your favorite DC restaurant right now?
Oh, my favorite. It's a restaurant called Centralina. I have two, actually.
Yeah, it's cool.
And Buck's Fishing and Camping.
Okay.
It's like my home and kitchen.
Your go-tos. What about, do you have a favorite New York City restaurant?
Right today is Carmelina Cafe.
Yeah.
Which is unbelievable.
Yeah, place is good.
Really good.
Getting rave reviews, top to bottom. A few more. Do you have a favorite recent cookbook discovery?
Well, a cookbook just came on my desk that I thought I'm going to really have fun with. It's a Niçoise cookbook.
Yes.
It's brand new. And I happen to like, the south of France. So I'm going to have fun with that one.
That's a beautiful book. I love that. I forget the author, but that's a great call. Your favorite city outside America to visit for food?
Where else? Paris.
I was like, where else? Israel, but no, Jerusalem, but where else? Paris, obviously.
Yeah.
That's a great answer. Last one, your favorite sandwich?
Pastrami with coleslaw and mustard.
What kind of mustard? Grainy, yellow?
Grainy.
Joan Nathan, this has been such a pleasure. It's so great to meet you. Thank you so much for joining This Is Taste.
It's been such a pleasure.
This Is Taste is hosted by Eliza Abarbanel and me, Matt Rodbard. The show is produced by Shalia Harris and Pat Stango and edited by Clayton Gumbert. Theme music by Steve Rydell. Visit Taste online at tastecooking.com and make sure to subscribe to our newsletter for updates on all cool things that are happening.